Okay, so just a question: did you guys get a chance to read the article? Okay, all right. Maybe I'll just pose Nate, I hope you got a chance to read it. Maybe you'll just pose the questions, because I have all these questions that I was going to, to have a discussion. But maybe it'll prompt me to respond as well. But let me at least start with something I can share with you. I just typed it up. Let me see here. Okay, no, it's not that Word document. Let's see, is it this one? Let's see if this is it. Ah, yes. Okay. All right, so you can see this. So I just wanted to give our time period. So 587 BCE, destruction of the first temple. The Babylonians come in and destroy it. We still have the prophets are still writing, and they're warning about this happening, and it happens. But it doesn't actually last for that long, which of course is why the destruction of the second temple has been so monumental in Jewish consciousness, because after the first temple was destroyed, what is it, about 50 years later, less than 50 years later, Persia conquers Babylonia. Persia conquers Babylonia, and they have a whole different approach to dealing with conquered populations. Their approach is, you guys know better than we do how to run your own country. And so, we want the taxes, but you guys run the show. So they allow the Jews to return. And during the 530s and the 520s, there are two waves of returnees to Israel. And there's a lot of tension. It takes a long time for them to get to the rebuilding process of the temple. There's infighting among groups as to how it should be done, or who's doing it, who's in charge. And we don't have that much material from this period. But eventually it is rebuilt. 516 is when the temple is rebuilt. But more importantly is about, around 70 years later, Ezra returns. So there's still a significant community, Jewish community, in Babylonia, Persia, what today is Iraq and Iran. And there's still a significant community there. And Ezra is what's known as a scribe. He's a priest, but he's also a scribe and a sofer. And this title is a little bit amorphous. It's not really clear what it is. I think it was Marcus who wrote a little bit about this, but in other books, some of the books that I've looked at are Shia Cohen's From the Maccabees to the Mishnah and Elias Bickerman's The Jews in the Greek Age. And they talk about this job of a scribe, a sofer. It's not clear what it is. The rabbis kind of lay claim to it as if this was an early rabbinic group. It's not so clear, but they're also not just simply writers. I mean, it comes out of the tradition. Jeremiah, the prophet, didn't write anything down, but he had Baruch was his scribe. He would write what Jeremiah's prophecies down, oracles, and so that they would be written. And it seems that must have been the beginning of what the scribal tradition was. They would write down things, but they also knew they had information. They had they were writers of legal texts, legal documents. And it seems that also they were the gatherers and writers of narratives of the Jewish story. And when Ezra comes back in 458, it's speculated that he had something, probably from the priestly tradition, of what we call the Torah today. It probably wasn't completed. He probably didn't have the whole thing, but he had some of it. And over the next 13 years, he, oh, hey, Joe. Over the next 13 years, he meeting with people in Jerusalem and other Jews who were there. Our understanding is that the Torah is compiled of different documents, different texts that were woven together. And so Ezra, during this time, seems to be putting the whole text together. Now in 444, Nehemiah returns from Babylonia. That's important because Nehemiah is a political leader. And when he comes, he and Ezra, there's this famous passage in the book of Nehemiah in chapter 9, where, and it's famous because our Torah reading today is kind of based on the structure of the way they read this document. They take the whole community, it's Rosh Hashanah, and they take the entire, the whole community is called together. It's kind of like clearly in the text, in the narrative, it's a redoing of Sinai. And they read the entire Torah, this document that they have. From the tradition standpoint, this is a document that people have forgotten about because of the diaspora, the exiles. From a scholarly point of view, it's probably the creation, or at least if it's not the complete Torah, it is some kind of proto-Torah of all the different books. And he reads it. They read it. There are Levites on the stage with them, and they read it to the community. And the people are shocked to find out, oh my goodness, we haven't been doing all the stuff we're supposed to be doing. And that becomes very significant, having this text now. So that's 445. About 100 years later, still under, during this period of time, they're still under Persian rule. About 100 years later, Alexander the Great shows up. And whereas Persia conquered the whole Levant back in the 500s, now Alexander Great returns the favor and he conquers Persia. But most important about that conquering, because he doesn't live that long, he lives only about 10 years after he conquers Persia, he's dead by the time he's 30, I think, or 30 something. And but he's ruling the Macedonians are now rule this major empire. What's most important is the culture he brings. He brings this Greek culture that had been developed obviously earlier in the time, the Plato and Aristotle and all these philosophers, and art and literature. And with his conquest, he brings it with him. And this becomes very significant as we talk about the development of the Jewish people during this period. By 300, okay, so 10 years later, he's dead. And his generals divide up the territory. Ptolemy rules Egypt, Seleucus rules Syria, and their descendants are the emperors of their regions. Judea is part of the Ptolemaic Empire coming from the south, in Egypt, Ptolemy, and that's the Ptolemaic Empire. And there's this kind of back and forth fighting between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, the northern kingdom, the northern Macedonian Empire, and the southern Macedonian Empire led by the Ptolemies. And they're going back and forth, and Judea is the land bridge between the two. So there's constantly back and forth fighting. But finally, by 200, the Seleucid Empire has gained control of Judea, and settles in, and it becomes part of the Seleucid Empire. Then we know that then comes with the story that we're all familiar with, because by the 160s, and I should mention that at first the Seleucids aren't so the Jews are fine with the Seleucids. Actually, the Jews were pretty fine with the Ptolemies too. They let the Jews, they recognized the Jews as a separate group, and they pretty much left them alone. They obviously, Ptolemy and Seleucids were pagans, but they didn't enforce anything. What changes is in the 160s, Antiochus Antiochus III was his father, and the Jews had it pretty good under Antiochus III. But Antiochus IV, and this is always a question, why? Why did he take such an antagonistic attitude towards the Jews? It's not so clear. Some scholars suggest that it wasn't his fault, it was the Jews' fault, that they were agitating against him, and he felt that he had to, show his authority. So he got tougher, then the Jews rebelled even more. It's one of those cycles. But it's not so clear why he had this anti-Jewish policy so strongly after his father was not really anti-Jewish. In 168, though, he goes too far. He desecrates the temple. That starts the war. We have books that describe this period of time. They're not in our Bible, but they are in the Apocrypha. So we do have some texts. The first book of Maccabees, second book of Maccabees. There's also some other books called the Maccabees, but they're not really history of the period. But the first and second book of Maccabees are historical texts of the period. This is also one of the problems we have with Hanukkah, because the Maccabees, Maccabees 1 has nothing to say about the miracle of the lights lasting for 8 days. The Maccabees 2 explains the reason why they celebrated this holiday for 8 days is because they missed Sukkot. So 8 was, instead of celebrating Sukkot for 8 days, they celebrated Sukkot as soon as they could with the reconquering of the temple, and that's why it has 8 days. So we have different stories from these chronicles of the Maccabees or the Hasmonean Empire. People assume that the war was over in 164. It wasn't. The war goes on with the Seleucids for another 20 years. It takes 20 more years for the Maccabees fighting the Seleucids to finally gain independence. Partially that was because the Seleucids finally gave up. They were having so many problems on their other fronts of the empire that it wasn't worth it for them to continue fighting with the Maccabees. And so they kind of cede control of Judea to them. And at this point, the king, so here's another interesting transformation. We're going to talk about transformations during this period. One of the transformations that goes through this period politically is that the Maccabees, Mattathias and his sons, are priests. They are part of the priestly clan, but they're lesser priests. They're not high priests. They're country priests who would, come and work in the temple for their yearly duties, but they weren't leaders. They weren't like they were living in Jerusalem. However, when they lead the war effort and are successful, they make themselves the high priests, and eventually they make themselves the kings. So it's the first time really in Jewish history where the religious leader and the political leader, that political leadership, are combined. And they basically do a terrible job of it. The first, I think it's the first one who does this is not Judah Maccabee. Judah Maccabee dies during this 20-year period, in war, and so do most of the other brothers. Simon, one of the younger brothers, becomes king and high priest, and then his son, John Hyrcanus, I'm pretty sure it's his son, John Hyrcanus, becomes king after that. And you can see he has a very long reign, over 30 years. And at the very beginning, it seems that the Maccabees were friendly with this group called the Pharisees. We'll talk a little bit about this too. There are these groups, sometimes they're called a sect, sometimes it's a school of thought. We know from Josephus and some other authors like Philo that there were at least 3 significant groupings in during this period of time. There were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. They're written about. There may have been more groups, but these are the 3 that are mentioned. The Pharisees they're not anti the temple, but they're not part of the temple. They're not made up exclusively of priests. And they have a different way of thinking about Judaism. It's much more focused on the text of the Torah, whereas the Sadducees are more connected to the temple cult. They're mostly priests. And so they have, it benefits them to remain conservative and hold on to a priestly Judaism and a cultic Judaism. And then you have the Essenes, which most people connect to the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the Pharisees, which are this group that are not so connected to the temple, you can understand that the Maccabees are pretty comfortable with them at the beginning. But as the Maccabees gain power, they seem to shift and become much more comfortable with the Sadducees, probably their natural allies, because they are priests, and it behooves them to support this cult, which is this cultic ritual group, which, it makes a lot of money. Everybody in the world all the Jews around the world at this time are sending half shekels to the temple. So in any case, Hyrcanus becomes an enemy of the Pharisees. His son Alexander Jannaeus continues that path. There's a lot of hatred between the 2 groups. His wife Salome Alexandra becomes queen after Alexander Jannaeus dies, and so there's a lot of again, continued animosity between the 2 groups. By the 60s, there's a tremendous tension and infighting among Jews. There are tensions with outside groups, because John Hyrcanus is the only, I don't know if he's the only, but he goes on a campaign to gain territory, and he is maybe he's the first, maybe the other Hasmonean kings followed him, but he forcibly converts. The only time in history that we know of Jews forcibly converting Gentiles to become Jews. And he forcibly converts these groups. One of the forced converts becomes the father of Herod the Great. Or maybe an ancestor of Herod the Great. In any case, the Hasmonean Empire is starting to crumble. And in 63, Pompey and Rome enter first to assist the Maccabees and the Hasmonean Empire, and then in the end to just take over. Then you have 37 to the year 4, Herod the Great is placed as king over the Judea by the Romans. And afterwards, there's sometimes they're Jewish leaders, sometimes the Romans put procurators over the, famous one is Pontius Pilate. 41 to 44 CE is Herod Agrippa, who is Herod the Great's grandson. He's actually one of the kings that the Pharisees got along with, the Jews kind of liked. Tensions continue to be very bad during this period. 66 to 70, the Jews rebel against Roman occupation. And while at first they're able to stave off the mighty Roman Empire, eventually by 70, they're defeated and the temple is destroyed. Still doesn't stop the fighting spirit. 60 years later, the Jews rebel again, this time with the leader Bar Kokhba, and this time the Romans completely wiped them out. Watching the Bears play Green Bay, it's a little bit like the Bears versus Green Bay. It's pretty, it only gets worse. Okay. So here are my questions that I was going to ask you guys. In reading, if you had read the Ralph Marcus article, and the first one was, what do you think the most significant change from the biblical period to the Hellenistic period? Oh, here's Nate coming back on. Maybe Nate read. Let's see if Nate has that thought.
Sorry, I had a phone call.
Oh, that's okay. I'm just asking if you read the article. I don't know if Joe read the article either, but what do you think the most significant change from the biblical period to the Hellenistic period was? There were a lot of, Marcus talks about a number of significant changes. I don't know what struck you if you read the article.
For me, I think as far as a long-term change, when the Persians took over and said, you can govern yourselves as long as you pay in, it established a need for a hierarchy that I don't believe was I don't believe, reading from the way that the biblical period was established, it was very much a peoplehood of, I don't want to say a tribal mentality, but you were just Jews going about your own business. And then the Persians take over and say, you guys can self-govern as long as you pay in, and then let us be, we'll be Persians, you'll be Jews, just contribute. And that sort of forces the Jewish people to say, well, self-govern, now we need to establish a government, so to speak. While before the biblical period, you have only these biblical rules. If you were to think about it as commandments, we're going to go from 10 as a biblical, in the biblical sense, to, encroaching on our 613. We need to now establish a whole system now, to move up to, now that we have to answer for it. That I feel is the biggest long-term change.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. I think that, and what you're also saying is that however the Jews were governing themselves earlier, in the king, while there were kings, or however that worked, they didn't have our understanding, this is not tradition, but our historical understanding is they didn't have that text of the Torah. You just mentioned the 613 mitzvot. They didn't have that. They didn't have a text that was their guidebook for how to rule, and how people were supposed to behave, on the expectations. And yeah, I think that makes a really big change. Also, I would say the relationship of the diaspora to the land of Israel, because however the Israelites were ruled during the biblical period, it was all within the nation of Israel. We do have the story of Esther, but Esther is later. After the Persian invasion, all of a sudden you have people who have developed Jewishly outside the land of Israel coming back into the land to say, okay, here's how it works. Here's how Judaism works. Here are the core principles. Here are the basic texts. Here are the most important rules. And I think it's very interesting, the interplay between diaspora and Israel, because Israel is always the center. Even as the diaspora is growing bigger and bigger, as I mentioned, they're still sending, the Egyptian Jews are still sending a half shekel tax to Jerusalem. So the diaspora is growing, getting more sophisticated, and yet Israel is the center. And then, of course, as the people from outside, Ezra, Nehemiah, as they come back to the center, they're bringing back a kind of a reformulated or a reconstructed understanding of Judaism. And I think that's really very interesting. Which is something that didn't happen during the biblical period. During the biblical period, it was all in-house, basically, right? It was organic within the land. So that's a change. So I think definitely another element, another significant change is the role of the diaspora. Now, I don't know. Did you get? I don't know. Again, Joe, if you were able to read any of the Great Ages and Idea book, or if Nate, if you ever read through the first part by Kaufman. But if you did, there was a significant, I noticed at least, a difference in appreciation of how Jewish change worked from the Marcus article. That is, Kaufman works really hard to insist that all the changes that are, that are significant. There's no Messiah really. There's hints of it in the Bible, but not the developed idea that we have today of a Messiah coming at the end of time and bringing in a new world order. The idea of divine retribution after this world, reward and punishment, like a heaven and hell type of approach. These are all new ideas that come during this period, that develop during this very long period between the Persian Empire and then the Hellenistic Empire. And Kaufman works really hard to show that any of these changes, they were in the Bible, they were in biblical Judaism. And so maybe there was some influence or some, a compliment. It was a compliment to thinking that was already changing in the biblical world. But no, this was all organic within the Jewish world. These ideas, these developments. Whereas Marcus is more open to the idea that these ideas came from Hellenism, that the conquering, by living in this cosmopolitan culture, both diaspora and within Israel itself, Jews were picking up ideas from the Greek philosophers. They were interested in Greek art, and they were attracted to it. And lots of Jews are he even mentions that there were, we don't know how many, but there were Jews who did leave Judaism for Hellenism. The famous story the famous rabbinic story is the tale of Acher. Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, who was one of the leading rabbis, has this mystical experience with Rabbi Akiva, Ben Azai, and Ben Zoma, and Akiva is the only one who survives intact. Elisha ben Abuya becomes a heretic after this mystical experience. And he's known as Acher, the outsider, the other one. But he was probably just an example of a number of Jews who were attracted to the outside. And so, and of course, I think that what's so interesting to me about the Marcus article is at the very beginning, he has a chapter that he says, resemblance to the modern world. So how did, Nate, when you were reading, how did you think that, how did that period resemble the modern world?
I think you see a lot more adaptation. What really stood out to me was we had the page in Ta'anit where the Jew who was a prison guard gets criticized for wearing brown shoes and not having, and he tucks his zit away instead of having it out. But for the Hellenistic period, you see also when you look at other things outside of this book, for instance, but like Talit Gadol has this very toga inspired fashion, and you start to see more of a, what I kind of felt is it's more of a attitude of, instead of having this isolated Jewishness, it's how do I bring my Jewishness to pop culture, as it were. You know, changing the fashion to match contemporary, you know, being more fashion forward, but still following what I need to do. You know, that's what, and Talit Gadol is the best example I can think of with it. It's, you know, there's other people have mentioned that it's resemblance to the toga. And when it became sort of more popular, it became the, well, how do I look like that, but still, you know, do what I need to do as a Jewish person, that sort of thing. So I kind of saw it more as this way of, you know, as you talked about the influence of the diaspora and that sort of thing. How do we fit into the outside world? You know, with Greek expansion and even later with under the Roman Empire, you know, yes, we're a part of this grander empire, but, you know, and sort of below it in that sort of sense, we're not independent, but now we also have all this access to expand and bring ourselves elsewhere. And even the ideas, you know, yes, Jews, you know, converted out, but other people now have a more of an opportunity to convert in without having to travel all the way to Israel to do so.
Right. Oh, that's a very good point too. Yes, you do have this cross transformation. It's not just about Jews picking up ideas from the Greeks, but Jewish ideas are entering the Hellenistic world too. That was really, that it was fascinating to me that, and I know that there's the statement in the New Testament that it's in Matthew, but I forgot who makes the statement that, you know, the Pharisees will go anywhere in the world to make one convert. They were big proselytizers, and we do have testimonies from the Greek world, the Hellenistic world, of especially women. It was really interesting. Women who are attracted to Judaism, and I think Marcus even hints at why, because the Greek world, they're pagans, of course, but they're moving, but as they conquer all these different cultures that are also pagan, they basically realize, oh, you know, we've got gods similar to your gods. And, oh, you know, maybe there's this kind of universal God system. And that notion of having that all the gods really lead to one God, or there's not so much difference, that they're kind of ripe. They're set up at that point for the notion of monotheism, that there's just one God. And I think it's interesting that perhaps women may, you know, again, if it resembles the modern world, you know, the women are often, you know, more spiritually attuned than men. And, you know, maybe they were much more attracted to this notion of this one invisible, incorporeal God, rather than these, the pagan stories and myths. But yes, I think that also the cross pollination. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I didn't read the Marcus, but a generation ago in the 70s, there was a professor, Henry Fischel, and I'm sure he's in the bibliographies of, you know, Marcus's work and everything. But having been to Egypt and Elephantine Island,
Oh, sure.
immediately I think Judaism never was monolithic, and
Yeah.
never monolithic. And Epicurus, it's in the Mishnah, and an Epicurus was a heretic. And where do you get that word from? It's Greek.
Well,
So
exactly.
Professor Rabbi Fischel, he mined all that cross-fertilization that you're discussing, because, and whether women were, it's like, I just never thought of anything ever being monolithic, and people do things privately, and then they can insult each other by calling them a heretic.
Right.
I just wanted to throw that out, because I think Henry Fischel, I would hope that.
Wait, is it Henry or Harry?
Henry.
Oh, it's Henry.
He was born in Germany, so it's Hendrik, but he's Henry Fischel in his writings. I'll send you the cross references. Okay. But I'm enjoying this because it's again, like I remember being on the archaeology dig of Herod, it outside of Jericho. I mean, golly Moses, you couldn't be in a worse neighborhood in terms of being between empires.
Yeah.
So you were never going to be left alone.
Right.
So you just not the neighborhood.
And I'm glad you mentioned that about the Judaism wasn't monolithic, because we don't know really. In the Bible, it seems like all the infighting is political, but but that's another example of resemblance, right? We have different approaches to Judaism. We certainly have more information about that from, as I mentioned, from Josephus, from Philo. There are these different Jewish groups. There's at least three, and a fourth one if you consider the nationalists, the Sicarii. And so you do have different, and then of course you have to consider the Christians. That was a separate Jewish group. They broke off completely. But at the time of the first followers of Jesus, they're all Jews. And so, yeah, you have these different approaches to Judaism. And that is not so different from the world we live in today, where we have different experiences and different. Yeah, I thought that was interesting that he immediately notices that. Here's another question for you. The biblical canon is being developed at this time. Ezra, as I mentioned, is believed to bring the Torah, if not to completeness, at least the initial text of the 5 books are being sewn together. Why do you think this is such a significant event? That is, to have a text, and a text that is the focus of your religion. And how does having a fixed text both restrain the imagination of that community, that religious community, and how is it a cause for growth and creativity? Having, and this is something, I can't remember if it's Marcus or Kaufman, but one of the authors says that this was unique. This was very unique in the ancient world. I mean, there were ancient religious texts, but to have a text as your religion's go-to, obviously other religions had texts, but they were secret. The only people who knew about it were the elite. But this is for everybody. Everybody had the text, and you were also expected to know it and to study it. So that was very unique in the ancient world. But how does having that, why is that so significant compared to other religious traditions that don't have the text? And then how does it restrain and how does it allow for creativity?
One second, sorry.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, any thoughts, Ina?
Well, when you were saying about a text, I'm immediately thinking about Hammurabi's code. Yeah. And that was a big deal in the Near East, that, all of a sudden you have some thing that's chiseled out in cuneiform that's, right. but then on the other hand, even, how many people were literate and who
Right.
promulgated it and who interpreted it. But, when I was in Egypt, one of the fascinating things was they had this public relations twirl that Akhenaten was the first monotheist.
Ah, okay.
So it was their twist of their understanding
Sure.
of we are responsible for monotheism. And did we learn that out here in America, that Egypt, we always heard it, about, the Earth story, Earth, the first time that,
Right,
we're
right.
gonna have, not an idol or something like that. And of course it wasn't, obviously Akhenaten is disputed this way or that, but I'm interested in what you're saying, because that I think for that does differentiate my understanding of modern Judaism, following, but again, I don't even, I mean, those were the inchoate years, before it was codified and canonized. So it was, again, Elephantine had its own little temple going on there.
Right.
So I don't, it's interesting, but I think it takes your breath away when I think about the formulation of the for good or for bad. I mean, both the Jews and the Christians were known the people of the book, but Jews were usually given the double whammy that they were too connected to that, the written words.
Well, I think that first of all, one thing that having a book faith, or faith based on a book, is, first of all, it's portable. So that allows, as the diaspora is growing, you can have greater uniformity amongst the people, because if I live in Asia Minor, if I live in the land of Israel, I live in Persia, as long as I have a version of this text, I'm connected to everybody else. All the other religions, if you, what tied you, if you were a part of another pagan group, whether it was a Persian or a Greek, and you moved to a different country, I mean, they also had their diasporas, but what would tie you is you would create an altar and you would give to, your gods in the other pagan culture. And eventually probably they assimilate and absorb one another. But if you have a text that's different from everybody else, then you're connected within your group. I think one of the things that Marcus and Kaufman and other authors mention that's so remarkable is that as the diaspora grows, on the one hand, the Jews become more focused on universalism. So on a negative of that means paganism isn't good for anybody. Nobody should be a pagan. It's not live and let live. It's you shouldn't be a pagan. It's wrong. On the other hand, but the positive is you see that the whole world should be connected under one rule, one divine rule. And yet at the same time, Judaism is able to maintain this kind of religio-ethnic basis, so that the Jews are still, you're with your fellow Jews. You're connected to Jews no matter where you live, whether you live in Israel, you live in Asia Minor, you live in Egypt, you're all connected through this text. Having it though, of course, you were restrained. You can't create any. At one point during this period, whether it's the 2nd century, the 1st century of before the Common Era, maybe even as late as into the Common Era, but at some point that canon is closed and you can't add any more material to it. So there's a danger of it becoming stultified. On the other hand, what it seems that within Judaism is it actually released creative energies, because if the text is fixed, but you still have questions, we just tonight at Evening Minion, Paul Price came in and he was asking me, he goes, how come he was studying the Akedah. How come Abraham is so quiet, but he didn't have a problem arguing with God at the Sodom and Gomorrah? And right, these are the great questions, right? These are the questions we all ask. But those are the questions that come up when you have a fixed text. You can't change the text. You can't change the story and say, well, you know what? This time Abraham's going to do something different. It's a fixed text. So therefore you have to, the creativity comes outside of the text. And obviously that's the basis of what we have as the oral Torah, Midrash. Shia Cohen says that there's three forms of creativity. There's translation, because the books are translated. The Septuagint is translates the Torah into Greek. And when it does that, in fact, we just read it we've been reading in Megillah, Tractate Megillah, it changes the text in significant ways because it has to explain to a Greek audience what's going on. And so translation is one. Greek is the language of the Jews of the East. Aramaic is, Greek is the language of the Jews of the West. Aramaic is the language of the Jews of the East and in the North. And so you have different translations now of this sacred text. Another way is paraphrasing, where you take a part of the verse and then you say, well, this is what it means. And then, of course, you have commentaries. And so this is the development of what we have today, the Midrash, and trying to make sense of the text in our own day. And we continue that to this day. That's a very significant factor in the growth, but also the tension in Judaism, which I never thought about, but reading up Marcus and some other scholars of the period, the fact that not all Jews are living under the same empire, and they're not all living under the same culture, and they're not all living under the same, although the culture is still pretty Hellenistic for most of this period, but they're not living under the same language. Because if Jews are speaking in the Jews in Egypt are speaking Greek, and the Jews in other parts are speaking Aramaic, now they all may know Hebrew. There are actually forms of there's different versions of Aramaic, but you have this breakdown in language. And so maybe that's another reason why the importance of Torah, because you still all have your sacred language, whether you speak it or not, I don't know. If people spoke Hebrew during this period, but if they're speaking Aramaic in one place, Egyptian in another, but your sacred text is in your sacred language, and you all have to know that language to make sense of your sacred text, then it does unite you. It's a little bit like, when you look at the Muslim world today, and I know that some non-Arab Muslims feel a little bit like, Arabs get to be the stars of the Muslim world, but they all have to know the Arabic of the Quran, and that ties you together, whether you live in Bosnia or Iraq or Indonesia. The fact that you have a sacred text in a language that you consider sacred connects these wide spaces, these wide geographic space.
I found it important that it gets written down in the sense of, talking about literacy of that time, the notion that someone's going to write a book that is for everybody and remove that sort of, for the time period, that elitist attitude towards literature and say, this is for you. Oh, I can't read that. Well, now there's this encouragement to learn, and here's a reason, and here's a, in essence, a sort of, to a certain degree, the equivalent of like a way to bridge that, I guess arguably even an economic deficiency. Here is No, now you're going to study it. Now you're going to know this when you do, now at least you can read something when you couldn't before. And it sort of encourages this whole scholarly attitude that goes along with it. I find also that writing it down, when you look at, and the time period doesn't exactly line up, but with a variety of what we would call, pagan religions or that sort of tribal societies, a lot of religious or spiritual things were specifically not written down. There was a whole notion that, and this carries across multitude of continents and stuff like that, where, we'll write down other things about history or geography, but our religion is strictly kept only through oral tradition. And now here the Jews come along and say, as another break from paganism, we will write our religion down. We will make it so that it cannot be lost or misconstrued or anything. This is it. And then, you had gone into it as far as its constraints on creativity. Well, yeah, we can't change the canon, but our next big thing is going to be Midrash and eventually the whole Talmud going into, we can't change any of this, but I can interpret it however I want. And then again, going into language, the fact that we have to write the religion in a way for it to appeal to other cultures goes back into that pluralism of it, Judaism's chance to spread throughout the diaspora. Now that we've written it down in Hebrew, now we're one step closer to translating it into Greek or anything else. And give it a chance to spread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, speaking of that, were you surprised to learn that Jews were so active in seeking converts during this time, and that there was even a category of semi-converts, Yirei Hashem?
I wasn't at all, only because when you look at any other, culturally speaking, they had to do something, especially to fit in as any, and I'm not going to say disparaged, but as any sort of minority that it must join in, you have to, you don't want to assimilate, because the cultural pressure to assimilate is going to be so strong.
Yeah.
So you have no choice really but to defend just as hard. So I wasn't surprised by that notion at all. Honestly, I'm more surprised that it kind of went away later, because they had such a grand interpretation. Like you said, even the semi-converted, and that we're still going to accept that notion and get all these levels in. I was surprised that didn't, with everything else that we're allowed to question, that ended up ultimately falling by the wayside later. But it made sense to me that they would have to go as hard, especially when at this point, even though it's still so early on into the culture, there's this notion of not being the conquered, so to speak, but this notion of changing hands. We're on our second temple. The idea that how much longer can it go on? And that notion for survival, you mentioned, now that we've written it down, now it's portable. Yeah. It can't possibly be lost.
Oh, did we lose you? Okay. There you are.
There's the movie Year One. They mention when the cavemen meet Abraham and Isaac, and they said, "Oh, God promised me this land from here to there." And Isaac says, "Yeah, except God didn't tell anybody else. We're at war with somebody every other week." I think the Jews are sort of getting into that idea as well. So we get the first notions of how do we survive in this ever-changing world.
Yes, yeah. I think that was. Wait, where was the quotation? Shoot, where was it was Mark. It was this chapter 6, I think, where no, it was the second part where he has that quotation from what's the quotation from Yehuda Halevi. Maybe it was chapter 5, where he says the Jews are the most adaptable people. Maybe it was in Bickerman. Okay. Well, anyway, it was somewhere that the quotation that the Jews have been the most adaptable of peoples. They're like he compared it to animals that are able to adapt to their environment. And here it is. Yeah, opening quotation from Judah Halevi. So why can't I find it? Well, anyway, but it doesn't matter. What do you think allowed for Jewish adaptations? Because Jews do adapt. They move from this notion of they're tribal to universal. We didn't even talk about worship, the importance of individual worship. All of a sudden, the individual becomes significant, right? In the Bible, everything is corporate. We're all the people of Israel. When God gets angry, he punishes the people of Israel. Now, all of a sudden, there's this idea that, hey, I'm important. Michael Friedland's important. And if I don't do what's right, then there is retribution. If I do the right thing, though, I should get rewarded. And if it's not in this world, because this world it seems so unfair, all of a sudden, wait a minute, well, what about just because the world's unfair doesn't mean that I shouldn't be rewarded at some point. So you know what? You're rewarded in the next world. So all these adaptations, what do you think allowed for Jews to be able to do that? Was it just serendipity, maybe, or was there something in our culture? And I don't know the answer to this. I'm just throwing it out. I don't know what it is about Judaism, maybe the monotheism.
I think it has a lot to do with the general sort of doctrine of faith. When you have something that's so different, you have to believe it without empirical evidence.
Oh, wait. So when you say faith, you mean, because pagans had faith too, but you're saying monotheistic faith because the Jews were so different. Their monotheistic belief system was so different.
Yes, in the sense that we have one thing that controls the whole universe, and it really is sort of the scope of the universe, not just us as a planet, as opposed to pagans, which have a lot more to do with the land and the earth and forces of nature. And to a certain extent, when you look at, say, alchemy, where it's the science of the time, you could almost argue that to that anachronistic sense, it was their empirical evidence. And as monotheists, we don't really have that. We have to believe that no, it was really just this one deity that is beyond our comprehension, and that forms this different, it's a doctrine of faith less than a superstition, or less than say a group of superstitions, and that becomes the foundation of, well, then surely there is something beyond that will make it work out. And it's the way to sort of square the circle of, here is a God who loves me in spite of the suffering or this unfair world that I live in. And the only way to square that would be that somehow, in some way, even if it's not in this world, this love will win out. I might never see it in a way that I can comprehend, but it will eventually happen.
Okay. All right. Any thoughts on, or I don't know if Joe, let's see here, Joe, you're muted, but any thoughts on that about from what your experience of, living in Egypt and around the world as a Jew?
I'm when I think about what someone else is saying, then I'm not formulating what I'm thinking. And I'm still percolating. I'm still thinking about what, I'm interested in what a generation brings to it, like Nate. And so I'm percolating. Okay. So I'm waiting yet, because it's, I'm percolating.
Okay. Joe, are you still working? Okay. Wow. Okay. Okay. I hope you're selling a lot of cars. Yeah, part of me wonders if it is a little bit of serendipity in the sense of diaspora. I mean, I know that other groups have experienced diaspora, but the combination of a monotheistic culture where you have a center in one place, and you know that's the only place that you can experience your cultic rituals, and then as you move outside of that, some of your people, I mean, move outside of it. If they hadn't been connected to the center, then it would have all. I don't know if we would still be Jews, but because they did retain that connection, and they imbibe the cultures around them. There's this the next author that we'll look at who writes the chapter on the Talmudic age, Gerson Cohen, one of the great Jewish historians of the 20th century. He has this terrific article called "The Blessings of Assimilation," in which he's basically talking about the same material that we're looking at. Of course, he's responding to it in a modern age where the critique of an American, I don't know when he wrote the article, 1960s, maybe 1970s, there was the criticism, oh, we're assimilating out, we Jews in America, because here it's a little bit different experience, and that we're so beloved, we're treated as equals, we're assimilating into ourselves to death. And his response was to look back in Jewish history and say, no, we survived because of assimilation. But you can't completely assimilate out. You have to have some core principles, and you maintain that. And I think even to this day, the fact that it doesn't matter what kind of Jew you are, most liberal, reform, conservative, Orthodox, of course, and for what I'm about to say, we all share the same text. That's about the only thing. We don't agree on Israel anymore. We used to agree on Israel. There's very little, maybe 60 years ago, we agreed socially, Jews stuck together. Now, a Jewish kid is just as likely to be closer. There's no reason why he shouldn't be as close to his Gentile friends as any Jewish kid he might meet at synagogue. So socially, we're not connected. Obviously, America believes in God, but they don't really believe too much in organized religion. Jews are the same. So, but the one thing that ties us all together, from the Hasidim to the most liberal religious Jew, is this connection to Torah. We all have Torah. We all relate to it in different ways, but we have this sacred text that we believe deeply in. And so that connects, we at least have that to connect us, even if we don't agree, see the same way. So I think that that's somehow having that centerpiece, that Torah. Maybe before Torah, you have the cult in Jerusalem, then you have the Torah text, and the ability to move wherever you are, hold on to the core principles, but imbibe, at least on an external, if not a more internal way, but imbibe these new ideas and these new cultures, so that Judaism, in a sense, is always fresh. I think that is what allows for the adaptation. Now is a very different time, right? Because once again, we have the center, but it's not the same idea as it was in the temple times and Second Temple times. We don't look to Israel as our religious center, right? Maybe some people do. I mean, but because Israel's a modern nation state, it's too controversial, right? Just today, some very critical news came out of Israel, very bad news for non-Orthodox Jews. The new government, which was supposed to be more open to non-Orthodox Judaism, especially since the the movements have won battles in the courts. They heard this week that one, they're not allowing an egalitarian space to go forward at the Kotel because politically it's too hot. And this young man from Uganda, Joseph Kibita, who's been living in Israel for 4 years, converted now twice, once in Uganda with conservative rabbis and once again in Israel with conservative rabbis, lived his whole life as a Jew in the Ugandan community, wants to move to Israel. He's been denied. Take care. He's been denied the permission. So Israel now becomes is not the center that it was in temple times, and yet it is a center. It is a place where Jews go back to and we're free to go to. And it is somewhere I think of Jews who, whenever anti-Semitism becomes dangerous, we look to Israel as, certainly many Jews look to Israel to move there. Currently, Jews in France are buying property in Israel because they're nervous about anti-Semitism there. So it's a different relationship. So it'll be interesting to see how it bears itself out. And if Israel can once again become a binding for Jews around the world, or if it becomes just one more area of tension. But anyway, all right, well, this was a great class. Even if you didn't read, you know so much.
I was thinking about when you were talking about Israel, I was thinking, I know some Israelis personally who refused to get married in Israel because they did not want to acknowledge. So they would go to Cyprus or someplace to have a secular marriage. So I know Israelis who don't want to acknowledge, because that, to me, it's I don't want to, should I say what I was about to say it's like a mafia, but I don't want to.
No, you're right. And
So
it's funny you said, because both my nephews got married in Israel, but they weren't registered officially in Israel because they didn't have approved rabbis. They're Orthodox, but they didn't have the Rabbanut rabbis. So when they came to America to visit their family, they went to City Hall and got their marriage license. So
this is I had a relative who got married in Israel, and to prove that you're Orthodox Jewish, it's I don't want, but I'm on that page.
Yeah.
I'm on that page.
All right. Well, this is great. So we'll look forward to next month. We will look at the Talmudic period with Gerson Cohen. But this was great. So we'll encourage, I hope Ann and Steve couldn't make it tonight, but I hope that they'll join us next time too. All right. I hope you and even more people. So great. Terrific. Have a good night. And Nate, I will record this.
Yeah. Thank you.
And send it out.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Bye.
Good evening.
Bye.